Well, hello there, everyone. I am Erica Carroll, the Education and Training Manager here at Atlona, and with me today is our Sales Engineer Manager, Seth Powell. Do you want to say hi, Seth? We'll give him
Hey
a sec.
everybody.
Hey. So great, thank you. We'll be hearing from Seth in just a few moments, but first I'd like to thank you all for joining us today as we continue to unravel another feature in this Velocity series. And today's focus is part 2 of our custom control GUIs. Just to recap, Velocity is an IP-based control system that's comprised of a few very distinct components, but today we're only going to be covering two. First is the gateway, which comes as a hardware appliance or runs as a VMware. And second is the touch panel or user-facing control pad. Now, by default, Velocity creates a simple control interface like the one you see pictured here, but in today's webinar, we are going to be expanding on what we taught you last month and teaching another option which allows you to customize these control pages. On that physical user interface side, there are a couple options. We offer PoE touch panels available in 8 and 5.5-inch versions that can be mounted in either vertical or horizontal orientation. Additionally, if you want to provide your own devices, there's also a license option for bring your own control devices to communicate with the gateway. With this license option, apps are available for Android and iOS devices. Plus, as you'll see today, we'll also have the ability to call up a control screen using a web browser. Now, this is where we left off last month, where we created a custom page. So it's a custom screen with a couple of buttons and a master volume slider. We were also able to navigate between these pages. So with that brief introduction, I will now hand the controls over to Seth, and we will continue to expand on that.
Thanks, Erica.
Hold on one second. There you are. All right, so you should have controls now, and we'll see his screen in just a second.
All right, let me know when you can see my screen, Erica.
I can see your screen.
Okay. All right, guys, so I just wanted to take 2 minutes maybe and just kind of recap exactly where we're at, because we are going to kind of start from the place where we left off last time. So we have created a room that we've called Custom GUI Demo. And in this room, we've added one of our SW510Ws, which is our wireless presentation switch with BYOD functionality. An Apple TV is a source. Of course, we have our BYOD source, which is just your, iPhones, Android tablets, Miracast from a Windows laptop, whatever you want it to be. We also have a laptop input, and then we have a single display that we've configured on the output. So pretty simple little setup. 3 inputs basically and 1 output. Last time we kind of did a decent amount of messing around with our custom GUI. I'll go ahead and actually launch this GUI, and we'll kind of just step through what we have so far. So we created a start page that's got a button covering the entire start page. So it just says touch anywhere to start. So I can click anywhere here. And if you remember last time, we kind of focused on these buttons over here on the left-hand side, these input buttons, specifically creating variables and setting up logic so that when I clicked on these buttons, they would turn orange as they're doing now. Part of that being that we needed to set up a condition on the actual button to basically toggle back and forth between white and orange for that button. And then part of that logic was also setting up macros so that we could basically make these buttons mutually exclusive from one another, meaning that when I turn the Apple TV button on and it turns orange, the other 2 buttons get turned off, right? So that regardless of what was selected previously, that button then goes back to a white color so that it only looks like one of these buttons is selected at a time. And of course, I have my volume slider up here up top for my master volume control. Today, what I want to do is, if I come back over here, you'll see, if I go to pages, you'll see I've created a couple other pages here. I've created an admin page, which if I go to my admin page is really simple, really straightforward. I've just created a couple buttons here that really don't do anything right now, which is fine. That's not necessarily the point, but I've got admin 1 through 4 buttons and then volumes 1 through 4. So maybe this is like an admin audio controls page. It doesn't have to be audio controls. It could just be admin controls for the system, whatever you wanted it to be, but I've created this admin controls page. I've also created a pin pad, which at the moment is blank, and that's part of what we're going to do. But if I go back here to the home screen, what I really want to do today is I would like to essentially make this admin page kind of hidden from view, right? I don't want my general end user to come in and to have a button on the screen that just says admin controls, where they can just press that button and immediately get in and start doing some deep configuration things on the actual system that could possibly screw the system up if there was if the wrong person kind of got a hold of those controls. So the way that I want to accomplish this is I want to kind of provide two layers of security. Layer 1 would be that I want to put an invisible button over this Atlanta logo. Now, it's not going to be an invisible button that if we tap it once, that it automatically drops us into the admin page. I don't want it to be something where if you accidentally hit it, that you get the page changes. So I want to set this up so that I have to hit this button 3 times in a row in order to actually get into the page. But then the second layer of security, kind of as I've already alluded to a bit, is I want to add a pin pad. So I'm going to hit this button, this invisible button, 3 times, and it's actually going to take me to the pin pad page. And then I've got to type in the correct pin pad or the correct pin code in order to get into my admin page. So it's kind of like a little bit of two layers of security for this admin page. So let's go ahead and get started on that. So step number 1, quite simply, I want to make an invisible button over top of this Atlanta logo, right? So add controls, and I'm going to add a button, and I'll drag this button over here, and we can just size it where we want it, something like that. And I'll make this a little smaller, something like that. So now we have our button right over top of our logo. And as you can see, that still has a physical border on it. Let's get rid of that. So border type is none. And that's it, right? Pretty simple, pretty straightforward. So now I have an invisible button that's over top of my Atlanta logo. Step number 2 here is that I need to know how many times I am actually pressing this button. So in order to do that, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a variable. So to create a variable, you're going to go to Tools. And as you can see, I've already created 3 local variables here, 1 for each button. Now, this is just to monitor my button state. This is how I think we dove into this slightly last time, but not all the way into variable creation. But more or less, this is just a binary variable. It's either a 0 or a 1, depending on whether or not that button is on or off. To basically just give us the button status or the button state, and we're toggling that back and forth, which is what is causing it to turn either orange or white. So you click this little plus button here to create a new variable. So I'm going to create a new variable, and I'm going to call this button count, or let's call it button counter. And my default value, I'm gonna initialize this variable to 0 because I haven't pressed the button yet. Okay, so now I have a button counter variable that's initialized at 0. And what I want to do is I want to increment that variable every single time I press this button. So if I double click this again, go back into the button properties on this, I can actually add to this press macro command and go to velocity. And if I scroll down, you can see there's a whole lot of variable sort of actions, right? We can set a variable to a specific integer or a specific string if we wanted to. I can append a variable, increment, decrement, increment variable, float precision 1, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, remove characters, all these things that we can do to variables. But what I want to do is I want to increment that variable. It's going to ask me what device. This is going to be a system variable, and it's my button counter variable. And then value just means how many, like we're going to increment by how much, essentially. I want to increment that by 1 every single time I press that variable. Okay. Now, anytime we're doing something like this, let's say that you want to just verify that your button counter is actually working, right? We haven't actually set up the logic yet to count to 3 and then do something once we count to 3. So what I want to do is I want to add a label here just to kind of check my logic, or to check what I've done. And I can actually assign a value to this label of a specific variable, right? So I can just print the variable to this label, and that's what I'm going to do for now, just so I can double check that my button counter is actually working. So let me relaunch this user interface here. And now you can see my 0 there. And if I tap this, however many times I tap that, it is just going to continue to increment my variable. So perfect. So it is working exactly how we want it to work. Okay. So the next thing I want to do is I want to tell this, okay, whenever I press this 3 times, I want it to take me to my pin pad page, right? Now the way I'm going to do that is, and there's probably a couple different ways we could do that. The way I'm going to do it, I'm going to go back to my room technology page here, and then I'm going to go to my room control options and event macros. All right, and actually I forgot to delete this last time, so let me delete this and act like we're doing this from scratch. So I hit the plus button here to create a new event macro. And now remember that we have event macros and we have room triggers. The big difference between event macros and room triggers is that event macros are what you're going to use to trigger a macro based on something internal to the velocity system. What I mean by that is you can trigger things on a specific button press within velocity. You can trigger things on a specific source to display route in velocity. In this case, I'm going to trigger something based on a variable within velocity. Now, room triggers are going to be different. Room triggers are a macro that is triggered based on something that I would consider to be external to velocity, meaning some sort of a sensor, right? So you would use a room trigger to trigger, something based on an occupancy sensor, or maybe an air wall sensor in a divisible room state or something like that. But I'm going to use an event macro for this. So you can see when I go to feature, it gives me all these things that I can use to trigger a macro. I'm going to go to variables, variable updated. So anytime it updates my button counter variable, it's going to be checking to see if this statement is true. So I'm going to put equals 3, which means that when my button counter variable is equal to 3, then I'm going to run this particular macro. And I'm going to name this security 1. All right. And the only thing that I really want to do here, actually 2 things that I want to do here. Number 1, I want to flip my page. So I'm going to go to velocity, and then I'm going to go to navigate page, and custom GUI demo, which is the room that we're in currently, and I want to navigate to the pin pad page. And then the second thing that I want to do is I want to reinitialize my variable for that invisible button. So I want to set variable this time, and system button counter and 0. And I just want to, I just want to do that because I want to have some way of reinitializing that variable. And I think it makes sense that anytime you flip away from that page, it initializes or reinitializes that variable back to 0, so that if I've already clicked it 3 times and I go away and then I come back to the page, I don't want it to remain at 3, because then this event macro will never trigger again, right? It'll only trigger when it flips from 2 to 3. So those are the 2 things I want to include in that macro. So now, anytime that button counter gets to 3, it's going to navigate to my pin pad page. So the pin pad page opens up, and it goes ahead and sets that variable, reinitializes that variable back to 0. So I'm going to save that. All right. And let's go back to our custom pages. And now, one thing that I do want to do is, since our variable is currently at 11, I want to actually go back in and, well, I can't initialize that. So you know what else I'm going to do? I'm also going to tell it to reinitialize that variable on the start page. So let's see. So let's go to pages, start page. Let's go here. And it looks like I had already done this previously as well. So system button counter and initialize that to 0. Okay. So now it's going to initialize my variable back to 0 when I hit the start page also. And then the last thing I want to do before I test this functionality really quickly is I'm going to go to my pin pad page, which is currently blank. And I just want to add a quick back button so that I can get back while I'm kind of testing this stuff out. But I want to have a back button on this page anyways. But I'm going to leave this up in the top left-hand corner. I'm going to remove the border, and there should be a little back button here somewhere. This works. Okay. Actually, and on this, I'm going to say page navigation, and we'll send myself back to the home page here. Okay. So let's launch this control again. All right, touch anywhere to start. As you can see, my button counter is currently at 0, 1, 2, 3, and it takes me to my pin pad page. Okay, cool. So that logic works. My back button will take me back. My variable's reinitialized. That's exactly what I want to see happening. So that part is done. All right, so on to the pin pad page. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to create a pin pad. Now, as you guys have probably seen already, or maybe you've seen, on our buttons, we actually have a copy and paste ability, right? So I can copy this button, and then I can paste the control, and it's actually copying every aspect of this button. So if I go back in, it has actually set up my navigation on this button as well. It copies everything, right? If there's positioning, if there's text or an image or a macro, it's going to copy every bit of that. That's going to be really useful in doing something like a pin pad, because you're doing a lot of sort of tedious work of setting those each dialer number up correctly. There's some things that we need, some parameters that we need to add in so that we can append our variable every single time. So let's kind of dive right into it. I'm going to make a button. And I have added in a little default icon that I want to use. So first of all, again, get rid of our border. My default icon is basically just a border that I made myself under uploaded images. It's just a white circle with a black background. All right, so there's that. So I want to add text here that just says 1. And let's try to center this. Now, as I increase my font, this is probably, yeah, it's not going to stay centered. I'm not going to worry about that too much right now. What we could do, well, what we could do is we could go absolute positioned, and then it's kind of a guesstimation here. That's pretty close. That's close enough. Okay, so 27 and 40 absolute positioned. All right, so that looks pretty good. Now, the only other thing that I need to add here is I want to append a variable. Every time I press one of these buttons, one of these 9 buttons on my keypad, I want it to append a variable that I'm going to create called, I guess we'll call it pin code. So we'll go back to tools and we'll create another variable. We'll call this pin code. And we're going to give this a default value of none. All right, so there's nothing in that variable currently. And so on this button press, I'm going to create. I'm just going to append this variable, right? So I'll go to velocity, append variable, system, pin code, and I'm going to append it with the number 1. Now, obviously, I'm going to put 1 through 9 as well as a 0 on there, and we want to append it with those specific numbers. But besides the fact that I need to change the text in the actual variable, and I need to add that, change that what it's appending it to, all of these buttons are going to be identical, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this, and I'm just going to start pasting this control, right? I'm just going to kind of lay this out really quickly here. And it'll allow us to kind of snap to our borders there, which is nice. So it'll look nice and good there. Paste control. And then one more. All right. And actually, I am gonna do 2 more here because we want to delete. We want to make a delete button and we want to make an enter button. It's gonna look something like that, right? All right. So then I'm gonna go through this, and I apologize. This is a bit tedious, but I just wanted to show the whole process instead of kind of leaving you guys to guess exactly what I was doing on every button. I kind of wanted to show the whole process because I thought it'd be nice for you guys to see kind of how simple this was and how quickly we can create something like this. Now, the other thing that I wanted to point out kind of while I'm going through this is there is actually a pin code built in to Velocity. However, that pin code can't be triggered wherever you want it to be triggered. That pin code is just really a lockout screen for the touch panel. So you can tell the touch panel to lock and it will go to a pin code as long as you set a pin code up. But that's all it will do. So, if, and I see that we have some questions, I haven't looked at those yet, but if one of the questions happens to be, doesn't Velocity just have a built-in pin code screen? The answer to that is yes, it does. However, that pin code screen can't really be used as a lockout for a specific page. It can only be used as a lockout for the entire touch panel. So what I'm trying to accomplish here is just a separate lockout for the admin page specifically, not necessarily for the whole touch panel.
Hey Seth, I'm going to go ahead and butt in real quick. Somebody asked, do we have templates pre-created for items like this? And I can touch on that a little bit and maybe you can elaborate. We don't have any templates built for any of our custom control pages because it's basically a blank canvas for you to do whatever you want to with. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, so, I kind of get where you're coming from with that. I know that some of the other big control manufacturers do have templates that are available for you to kind of start with, and then sort of some graphical resources to go along with those templates to kind of get you started. Right now, we do not have those. The only graphical resources that we have are what you see in our sort of button packs that, you know, you go to icons and you drop down and there's like a bunch of different icons that you can utilize. We've discussed doing something like that for a while, and it's something that we're still sort of in conversations about. The long and short of it is that there's a significant amount of resources that kind of goes into generating that sort of content. And we're just trying to sort of lay out a scope of what that should look like in the future. But as of right now, no, we don't have that. It's all sort of customized. The circle that I've got here, I just put together. I just made a quick little circle in Photoshop and saved the image. And I do that every once in a while. But the icons that we have in our library already generally are enough to get you pretty far. So hopefully that helps. All right, so I've gotten everything now in the actual pin pad. Now I need to create an enter and a delete button. So for my delete button, instead of appending a variable here, I want to, there's these functions here that say remove in characters left of variable or remove in characters right of variable. So really what that means, left of variable or right of variable, basically it's talking about on the right side of the variable or on the left side of the variable, right? In this case, I want it to act basically as a backspace, right? So that's going to remove things that I've just typed in, which are going to be on the right side of the variable. So I'm going to go remove in characters on the right side of the variable. And again, system variables, pin code, and we're only going to remove one character at a time. You can remove as many as you want at a time, but I just want to remove one at a time. Again, I just want that to work as a backspace button, essentially. And then down here, this is going to say delete. And let's make this font smaller because it's going to have to be. Yep. Okay, so that needs to come back this way significantly. Let's go 25 and down a little bit. So 35. Yeah, good enough. And then here, this is going to be my enter command, which for now, I'm just going to delete this because we're going to kind of get into what we're going to do in a second for that. Let me just put enter here. Font size was 22, and can't remember what I put here, 30. Yeah, 28 and 38. Pretty good. Okay. Okay, so there's my pin pad. And then, you know, again, I want to be able to check my logic here. So I also want to print that pin code variable to the screen. So I'm going to add a label. Put this up top here. Just kind of size this to be about the same size as my pin there. And my label on this is going to be my pin code. And I'll center this, put it in the middle, and make it a little larger. Actually, since this is just going to be numbers, go to 38, which is how big the numbers are there. Okay, perfect. So let's test this out really quick. So touch anywhere to start, and then I'm gonna 1, 2, 3. It takes me to my pin code, and 1, 2. Oh, you know what? It actually is initializing that to none, so actually the string none. So let's go back in to tools See if we can initialize that to just nothing. I think that's what I did yesterday. Let's double check that. Yep, okay. And then delete, 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 delete. Okay, so that works perfectly fine. So then the last thing that we want to do is we want to put our logic together that basically says when I press the enter button, I want to check that pin code and I want to see if it aligns with what I've set my pin code as in the software. And then if it doesn't, if it does, I want to pass on to the admin page. If it does not, I want to display a little message that just says pin incorrect. All right, so let's go back. So first things first, so let me actually make this a little smaller because I'm gonna put one other, and I'm actually gonna, I don't like what that looks like, so let's put that on the top. And I'm actually gonna create another label. I'm gonna put this label up here. And we'll center this. And let's make that a little bigger. 22 is fine. And I want to make the font red. Okay. I want to make it red because that's what's going to say pin incorrect eventually. The way I'm going to do this is I don't want this to actually say anything now. I only want it to say something when I hit enter if the pin code is incorrect. So in order to do that, I'm going to create a new variable. I'm going to call this one pin label. And I'm also going to not put a default value on this because I want that label to be blank until we tell it to not be blank. So going back in here, and this just the new variable, that's what it is. It hasn't actually updated in the system yet. I clicked on it a little too fast, but that's okay. So I'm going to set the value to new variable, which is my pin label variable. And basically what I'm going to do is when I press this enter button, I'm going to run an if-else statement, right? And that if-else statement is going to say if your variable pin code is equal to, you know, some combination of numbers that I put in. Now that could be 4 numbers, it could be 50 numbers if I wanted it to be. It doesn't matter, you know, however many numbers you want it to be. If this variable pin code is equal to the pin code that I want it to be equal to, you know, my actual passcode, then we're going to pass myself into the we're going to run a macro called pin passed, right? And that macro is just going to forward us over to the next page, the admin page, and it's going to reset my variable, my variable pin code. If the pin code variable is not equal to what I set it as, then I want to display pin incorrect, right? So first things first, let's go back and let's actually create our pin passed and pin failed macros, which again, I think I've already created, but I'm going to delete these real quick. Sorry guys, those are forgot to delete everything on this side of things. Okay, so I'll hit the plus button to create a new variable, or a new macro rather, and I'm going to call this pin passed. Oops. And here, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to navigate page, custom GUI demo, and we want to go to the admin page. All right. The second thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to velocity, set variable, system, pin code, and we're going to leave this blank because we want it to initialize back to nothing, back to a blank state. All right. I'm going to create one more macro here, and this is going to be pin failed. Velocity. And here I'm going to set variable because I want that label to now say pin incorrect, right? So system, and we're going to go to pin label, and we're going to say pin incorrect, exclamation point. Right, so it's going to set that label to pin incorrect, and it's also going to reinitialize that variable of pin code. And we're going to leave that blank. All right, so now one quick thing, by the way, something that I do sort of just out of habit, but figured I'd comment on it really quickly. You may have noticed there's a save button up here. Everything outside of the custom GUI screen where you're actually, making your changes on your custom GUI, there's an actual save button. And if you don't save things out here, they go away. So if I were to just click off of this and close this window, those macros that I would have created just would go away because I haven't saved them. So I need to save those. So I save those right there. But to reiterate, if I go into my custom pages and I want to change a button, by the way, or, in this case, I'm going to get rid of that because I don't want to see that anymore. But, let's say I want to change a button. I can go in and make a bunch of changes on this button, and there's no save button anywhere. It's just saving these changes automatically. So just a little tip for you guys to remember. Okay, so let's go back into my pin pad. And what I want to do on my inner button now is on press, I want to create an if-else statement. So I'm going to go to Ifelse Logic. And I actually forgot that it's asking you, all it's doing basically is ask you for a specific variable. And my variable in this case is going to be pin code. If pin code is equal to a specific value, in this case, I'm going to set that value to 1234. That's going to be my pin code. Then I want to run my pin passed macro. And I forgot that it does actually ask me what I want to set my variable value to. So technically, I didn't really need to reinitialize that pin code variable because it's reinitializing that for me as part of this if-else statement. But that's okay, it's not a big deal. So I'm going to leave this value blank because I want it to initialize back to nothing. And then else, so if it's not equal to 1234, then we're going to run my pin failed state. And again, we're going to reinitialize that value back to nothing. So that should be it. So let's test this really quick. So I have my buttons that work still. That's good. My volume, hit this 1, 2, 3 times, takes me to my pin pad, and I'm going to deliberately get it wrong this time. And you see it reinitializes that and it says pin incorrect up here. So that's perfect. And now I'm going to try again. 1, 2, 3, 4, enter, and it takes me through to my admin page. So there you have it, guys. That's kind of as far as I wanted to get today. I think that brings us to a pretty good spot, and we can go ahead and jump to questions.
Awesome, thanks, Seth. So I do have a handful of questions here. Some of them are focused on the actual programming that goes behind it, and if we can see the code that the system has created, can we take the code out? What language is the code written in?
Sure. So yeah, I'll try to. I'm assuming those are a bunch of different questions that I can answer in one kind of fell swoop. Is that fair?
Yes.
Okay. So as of right now, you don't have the ability to go in and see the actual code. Now, if you wanted to do fully customized coding, essentially, for your user interface, rather than this drag and drop interface, you can go in here and go to Velocity Tools, and you can actually, create new files. If I can remember how to, there it is. So you can create a file, and basically all it is HTML5, CSS, and JavaScript, right? So if you have a front-end web developer that works for you, or that you guys hire out to do this sort of thing, certainly they can make their own GUIs just using front-end web development, HTML5, CSS, and JavaScript. Now, the actual code that's happening behind the scenes when we're doing something like our custom GUI builder and actually the code that is running all of Velocity is a language called Golang. Now, Go is it's not a particularly common language, and because of that, it's not something that we've opened up to the public yet for coding on Velocity. Mainly because we know the type of support that's going to warrant right off the bat. It's going to get really, really tough to support fully programmed, customized interfaces without sort of growing this a little more linearly, if that makes sense. And so that's our sort of roadmap right now, is to try to grow this in steps, which is kind of what we've been doing. If you guys have been following along with Velocity since the very beginning, we didn't even have custom GUIs, right? And now we've built just a custom GUI editor that allows us to do sort of drag and drop custom GUIs. And that's sort of the step that we're on right now, where we feel very comfortable in being able to support this level of customization. With full-on programming right now, and especially sort of not having training classes yet to be able to sort of teach that to folks. That's all stuff that we need to sort of build up behind the scenes before we release that aspect of Velocity. We do anticipate that being available eventually. It's just not available right now. So hopefully that answers a bunch of different questions that you got there.
Great, thank you. So I have two questions also specifically about the pin code. So first, instead of showing the numbers on the keypad when you're pressing the button, instead can you show an asterisk so that the number characters are not shown? And also, can you have the pin code stored somewhere so that a user can change it without having to go back and rewrite the code yourself?
Okay, so let's back up to the asterisk one first. I'm gonna have you ask me that second question again, because I was kind of thinking about the first question. I've made pin codes previously where instead of having everything on a single page and just evaluating, I was actually just flipping different pages every single time you pressed a button. To make it a little easier to keep track of where I was at. And when I did that, I did make just a static label that would add an asterisk every single time so that you couldn't actually see the pin code. So the point being, there's generally a bunch of different ways that you can do these types of things. One of those ways that I've accomplished that before is the sort of roundabout way of flipping pages every time you press a button. Obviously, that gets much more complex in the actual logic and trying to track these things, because what you're doing is, instead of utilizing variables, your variable is the page flip, right? Every time you flip a page, you're tracking what button state you're on. If you're on 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., and you're adding an asterisk to the page instead of a number. I'm sure there's another way I could do that. Like, I was trying to think of another way, like maybe creating, maybe you have another button count variable that you're appending or that you're incrementing every single time you press any of the number buttons. And based on how many based on the number count variable, you're applying that number of asterisks to the label. I'm sure there's a way we could figure out how to do it that way. That would probably be the easiest way. So the short answer to that question is yes. The longer answer is I think there's a bunch of different ways you could do that. I'm not really sure, how easy or hard that is right off the bat, but there's definitely ways you can do that. And then can you ask me that second question again, Erica?
Sure. Can you have the PIN code stored somewhere so that the user can change it without having to go back and rewrite the code?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I think the way that we would do that is we would just create another variable, right? And so well, I'm trying to think, because then on the if else statement, it's asking you what you want to compare that to, and it doesn't give you the option of comparing it to another variable. Because of the way the if else statements are set up, right off the top of my head, I want to say that right now we can't do that. However, I believe that it would be very easy for them to change that so that you could compare your variable either to another variable or to like a static value. So I can ask them to add that. I'm pretty sure that would be simple to add. And then once we add that, it would be as simple as creating another variable and having another screen that the user can navigate to actually update that PIN code, right? Or maybe you're updating that PIN code from an admin panel somewhere that the end user doesn't actually have access to, or something like that. But yeah, I think we could probably set that up pretty easily. It's not really available right now in this iteration of Velocity, but I think that'd be pretty easy to accomplish.
Okay, so this is another two-part question, and the first part I already sort of answered in the chat, but I wanted you to touch on the second part. So the first part of the question is, with a dozen global variables, even in just 6 rooms or touch panels, doesn't this get cluttered? Is there a room level variable option? And I mentioned that although it says that it's a global variable, each room holds its own control pages, so that would be at a room level. So the follow-up question to that was, what if we truly need a global level variable, like access across all rooms?
So actually, so you are right, Erica, in that the variables are unique to each room, in that if I go into my tools page, it is going to allow me to create new variables for that specific room. However, they are global in the sense that even from another room, when I drop down that if I'm doing like logic based on a specific variable, it doesn't ask me. Oh, actually, you know what? I am wrong. It does ask me which page. So it asks me which room I want to go to. So I select system, right? System variable, and then it asks me which room that system variable is in. However, as long as I'm on a single gateway, I can perform operations on variables from one room that the variable is in a totally different room, right? So we do that all the time with divisible room scenarios, right? Because you have a variable, you have to create a variable in a specific room to determine room state, right? And so I'll create, a lot of times what I'll do in a divisible room scenario is I'll create a room that actually doesn't have any hardware in it, that I just utilize to build my logic in, right? So that the other rooms don't get super cluttered in terms of building logic and macros and variables and all these other things. I'll build one room that has no actual hardware in it, that is just my control logic, and I'll put all of my variables in there. And then I'm changing those other rooms based on those variables that have been created in a sort of a sort of invisible room that's just my logic, that's just my control logic. Does that make sense? So they are actually global variables that can be utilized to process functions in other rooms outside of the room where they're created. However, they are specific to that room in that they're contained within that one room. Hopefully that, I feel like that's confusing the way I just worded that, but hopefully
A
that kind
little
of,
bit, but I understand what you're saying. Can you show us when you're looking at those different variables, when you need to
yeah,
manipulate them? Because the question came in, if so you're cloning the room and all of its variables becomes confusion as to which one you are working with. So if you could show us
yeah.
what that looks like, I think it'll be a little bit more clear.
Yeah, that's a great point. So, essentially, it's kind of like when I went to this, so, so this is a bad example because when I go to my event macros here, this is going to have all of your variables, right? So if I clone this room, now all of my variables, these are basically going to all be doubled, and you're not going to be able to tell the difference between the ones that are doubled. So what you'd have to do is, in that case, you'd actually have to go into that secondary room and change those to Apple TV 2, laptop 2, BYOD 2, et cetera, et cetera. So you know what those actual variables are. What I was talking about is, let me think here. How about if I go back to my pin pad and then my enter button, like on this logic here. No, that's a bad example too. Let me go back to maybe it's the macro that I'm thinking of. Yeah, here, let me create a new macro so I don't break this. And I'm gonna go to velocity, set variable. Oh, actually, you know what? Okay, and I'm actually wrong about that. So it is just a system variable, right? So it's going to just be the system. So you would have to name your variables appropriately. So regardless of how many rooms I have and how many variables I have within those rooms, you would have to actually name those variables appropriately. So if I were going to have, 5 copies of this room, this would have to be, Apple TV room 501, laptop room 501, BYOD room 501, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, so that I know exactly what those variables are. I was thinking of something totally different. I was thinking it did ask me actually which room it was in, but it doesn't actually. So yeah, that's a great point. That's something that I can send as feedback back to our team. I am interested in actually exploring that a little further, seeing if maybe there's an option where here, once we select system, we then select which room that variable is a part of. So that's definitely not a bad suggestion.
Okay. So I have one more variable question. Is there a way to set the variable back to 0 after a set period of time? So this is going back to the
Yeah.
beginning when you set the variables.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about that earlier this morning because I was thinking the same thing. On our invisible button on the screen, you may want it to say basically um, maybe like 30 seconds after a tap. If that hasn't been tapped again, then we want to set this back to 0. I couldn't actually think of a way to do that off the top of my head. We do have scheduling built into this, so there is an internal clock. Something that this was something that I was actually planning on asking them about already, them being the developers, about the ability to create a counter essentially, right? That we can set up like a 30-second counter that says, okay, every time you press this button, we're going to start a 30-second counter. If that 30-second counter reaches 0, then we're going to reset the button counter variable back to 0, right? So that if you accidentally tap the button counter variable, not knowing, or the button counter button, not knowing that that button's there because it's invisible, why would you know it's there? 30 seconds later, it resets itself back to 0. So you don't accidentally, after using the system for 30 minutes, you don't accidentally send yourself into the pin pad and not have any real idea of what you just did. So it's a good point. Right now, we don't have the ability to do that. I was trying to think about how to do it this morning, but I don't believe it's something we can accomplish right now. Since we do have an internal clock on this, I don't think it would be hard at all for them to set something like that up. So that was some feedback I was going to send back to the development team.
Awesome. So we're still getting some back end, I would say maybe programmable questions. How about accessing controls properties as if they were variables? And I'd like to say that velocity can be accessed by any admin through any web browser. So I don't think that you actually need to access all of these back-end features just from a control panel. I don't think the control panel is meant to be a control the velocity system setup configuration sort of situation. And that's not how I would recommend using it. So Seth, do you have a comment on
Yeah.
that?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, the way I've seen some more advanced configurations be done before, like I helped someone with a four-way divisible room once, and he set up an admin page that only he had access to, that essentially would allow him to go in remotely and view like all of the variable states. It was exactly as I set up earlier, just to monitor the state of my button presses. He set that up for like all of his variables on a specific page, and then had like buttons that allowed him to like reinitialize variable states, right? Certainly, you can manipulate variables from a different control screen. I think to Erica's point, especially in a scenario where you're the integrator and you're handing this off to an end user, you just have to be really careful about, exactly what you give someone access to, right? And if you are giving them access to it, I would highly recommend it being protected by, multiple different security measures, and only giving a specific admin that knows what they're doing access to that's been trained. I see like a colleges and universities all the time where people just tell me that those help desk lines just explode with these professors that just have no idea how to use a system, right? And maybe that's poor user interface design or user experience design, but at the end of the day, I think sometimes less is more, right? So.
Yep. So that brings us almost at an hour, and we've had a plethora of questions, so I appreciate everybody who participated in that. Thank you to Robert and Frank and Emil for all of your feedback in the questions. And with that, you can catch us in, I believe in 2 months is our next one. Next month we're skipping, and we'll have an Atlona product update webinar, but in November we'll have our next addition to this velocity webinar. Thank you again. And Seth, do you have any closing remarks?
Nope, nothing for me. Thanks a lot, guys. Appreciate you joining today.
Awesome, thanks. And I know we had a lot of questions just based on the fundamentals of velocity as well. If you get a chance, you can go to atlonaacademy.com and register for our e-learning. If you want to dive deeper, the training only takes about an hour, and you can learn the basic backend system, which would be the foundation to what we've built out today. So please feel free to take advantage of that. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.